The first sign was not the laughter. It was the empty space where my name should have been on the mahogany table. My name is Nathaniel Kingsley. I am 48 years old. And that morning, I walked into Hawthorne Global Energy's glass boardroom, carrying the leather closing binder for a $2,800,000,000 capital restructuring package. My firm had spent 8 grueling months building. 4 live cameras were already operating. The glowing red indicator lights were impossible to miss. One camera fed the board archive. One streamed directly to institutional investors. One captured the legal record. And one was for corporate media, which meant every smirk in that room was already being preserved as permanent evidence. I noticed the missing nameplate first. A junior catering assistant stepped toward me with a hesitant half-smile, holding a silver tray. Support staff usually remained along the back wall during major financial closings. I looked at him, then down at the vacant space between 2 corporate vice presidents where my brass nameplate should have rested. "Do they need something before we begin?" I asked quietly, adjusting my jacket. He flushed with sudden embarrassment and retreated 2 paces toward the sideboard. Across the wide table, several board members pretended to review their briefing binders, flipping pages with artificial intensity. Carlton Hawthorne, the chief executive officer, kept turning pages in his custom leather folder, completely unbothered by the subtle exclusion taking place right in front of him. His wife, Regina Hawthorne, who held no executive title but treated the corporate headquarters like her personal residence, did not look away. She inspected me from head to toe, shoes, tailored suit, leather folder, face in that exact order of dismissive evaluation. I walked toward the main table anyway, and extended my hand across the glossy wood toward the incoming operating executive. "Good morning," I said Nathaniel Kingsley before he could reach out or accept the gesture. Regina leaned toward the active table microphone. Her voice carried clearly across the surround sound speaker system, polished with practiced disdain. "Someone get that temporary assistant a coffee." The room broke instantly into the kind of nervous laughter weak people produce when they fear standing alone. One vice president chuckled, then another joined, creating a cruel chorus of executives who preferred participating in public humiliation over enforcing professional decency. I lowered my hand at my own pace, maintaining complete composure, not because the insult failed to register, but because in that precise second I realized nobody at that table possessed the courage to intervene. Not the legal team, not the independent directors, and certainly not Carlton Hawthorne. He glanced up for a brief second, then returned to his printed agenda, treating professional dignity as entirely optional whenever his wife chose to strike. So, I moved to the last open chair at the far end of the boardroom, an unassigned seat without a microphone, and placed my closing binder flat on the table. If they genuinely believed I was merely a temporary assistant, why did the room grow so unnaturally quiet when I refused to argue or explain myself? The meeting proceeded as though nothing unusual had transpired. That was their first catastrophic calculation. Carlton clicked to the opening slide, maintaining his smooth presentation cadence. He spoke in the grand corporate vocabulary that powerful men rely on when they assume their authority is absolute and unquestioned. Strategic alignment, debt restructuring, leadership transition, restored investor trust. He repeated the word partnership 4 times within 60 seconds. He never uttered my name. He never acknowledged Summit Capital. Quentin Stafford, the newly designated operating executive, took over the presentation next. His tone was smooth and completely confident. "The debt restructuring facility is effectively secured," he states, gesturing toward the digital display with an open palm. "At this juncture, we are simply finalizing administrative schedules and execution timing for the primary tranche." Several directors nodded along in agreement. Regina leaned back in her leather armchair, smiling as if she had successfully restored order. She had already concluded I was harmless background clutter. When Quentin paused for breath, I looked down at my binder, then met his gaze directly. "One question," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient hum of the air conditioning system. "Who is confirming the lead tranche capital release sequence?" The reaction was immediate. A senior director shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Someone at the far corner exhaled sharply. Regina turned toward Carlton, visibly irritated that I had dared to interrupt the presentation flow. Miles Dunlap, the general counsel, froze mid-sentence over his notes. He recognized precisely what that question signified. I placed my phone flat on the polished table, opened the secure authorization protocol, and slid the closing binder forward until the flagged covenant appeared. Material Conduct Revocation Trigger Lead Tranche Disbursement Authority, the structural backbone of the entire package. Before we proceed to slide 5, I said calmly, "You may want to verify who holds final disbursement signatures for the principal commitment." Pages began turning rapidly around the room. Regina's condescending smile flickered for the first time that morning. Carlton looked directly at legal counsel instead of the digital screen. If their funding was truly secure, why had a single sentence forced the entire room to inspect their legal documentation? Carlton reached for the slide remote again. Attempting to regain control of the room, I did not let him. Before the next slide, I repeated, maintaining an even tone. "I need confirmation on who holds release authority for the lead tranche of $1,820,000,000. Carlton looked up slowly. Irritation surfaced first, followed quickly by cautious hesitation. "We will take staff questions after the formal presentation," he said, turning back toward the screen as if that settled the matter once and for all. I held his eyes across the table without flinching. "I am not staff." That statement landed far heavier than they anticipated. No one moved for several seconds, so I provided the formal introduction they should have requested before the live broadcast began. Nathaniel Kingsley, managing partner at Summit Capital, sole authorized signatory for the lead capital tranche. The chief financial officer's hands froze over his documents. He flipped 2 pages forward, then back, his face gradually draining of color. "That is accurate," he admitted in a strained voice. "Without Mr. Kingsley's explicit sign-off, the debt syndication cannot legally execute." Nobody laughed. Nobody even attempted a polite chuckle. The atmosphere in the boardroom transformed instantly, from arrogant certainty to palpable tension. A director seated near the window glanced up nervously at the live camera. Mounting in the corner, realizing the entire exchange had been recorded. Another stopped taking notes altogether, staring blankly at the table. Regina's smirk thinned into a tight line, though she attempted to maintain her poise as if this awkward moment could be erased with a lighter tone. "Oh," she said, her voice far too airy. "Then perhaps there has been a minor misunderstanding among the support staff. Perhaps we should restart the presentation properly," Quentin added, leaning forward hastily as though a reset button still existed on the table. Miles Dunlap finally spoke, his voice measured and extremely tense. "Before we proceed any further, the conduct clause must be reviewed. If a reputational event has been logged on the official record, we are legally required under federal compliance. Guidelines to preserve the documentation and evaluate exposure immediately." As if summoned by his statement, the central conference phone illuminated with an incoming high-priority call. Carlton pressed the speaker connection. The voice of Beatrice Hawthorne, senior board director, came through sharp, crystal clear, and completely unyielding. "Do not cut the video feed. Keep those cameras recording every word in this room." In an instant, Carlton was no longer the sole authority in that boardroom. Now that they understood my identity, were they more terrified of offering a public apology or of losing $2 billion in front of their institutional shareholders? Miles opened the master term sheet with visible hesitation. Under the breach of fiduciary duty doctrine and Section 102 of the Delaware General Corporation Law, documented misconduct by executive leadership, causing material reputational exposure, permits immediate revocation of the lead capital commitment without financial penalty, rendering all subsequent liability protections void ab initio. He read aloud, his voice dropping slightly on the final words. Regina issued a short laugh, the defensive sound people make when they believe danger requires a loud voice to be real. "Oh, come on," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. It was an obvious joke meant to lighten the mood before a long meeting. No one responded to her defense. That silence proved far smarter than she was. Carlton attempted to intervene, but not to correct his wife's behavior. "Let us not inflate a minor casual comment into something catastrophic," he said, opening his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. There has simply been a slight misinterpretation of intent. I did not argue morality. I had no need to engage in argument. The table microphones were active. The 4 cameras were recording. The feed is currently archived in the board system and live on the investor portal. I pointed out smoothly. For the first time that day, a vice president at the end of the table looked genuinely terrified. Miles lowered his eyes to the paper, completely powerless to alter the recorded facts. On the speaker line, Beatrice's voice sharpened into a direct order: freeze all capital disbursement sequences until legal risk and reputational exposure are fully evaluated by the board. Quentin tried to salvage the room with corporate jargon. This is an optics challenge, not a structural governance event. We can issue a joint statement clarifying the context. That sentence damaged their position further because what he termed optics, the board recognized as toxic executive culture. Not an awkward joke, but an explicit demonstration of how executive power behaved when it assumed no one possessed the standing to hold it accountable. Carlton requested a brief recess, his voice tight, clearly intending to pull me into a private corner office where he could negotiate without witnesses. I stood up, but I did not step toward his private office. You still possess one viable option, I stated clearly, looking directly at Carlton and Regina, a formal recorded apology on this live stream. Right now, before the session concludes, Regina crossed her arms and glared at me with sharp defiance. Nobody destroys a $2,800,000,000 transaction over a harmless comment to an assistant. If she truly believed this was merely an awkward moment, what would she do when I stopped offering opportunities to resolve it? I picked up my leather folder, walked out of the boardroom, and closed the heavy glass door behind me. The room remained motionless for several seconds. That hesitation confirmed everything I needed to know about their internal collapse. I stood in the quiet hallway and dialed Silas Thorne on the second ring. He answered instantly. "Do we have documented cause?" he asked without wasting time on pleasantries. "We have live audio, high-definition video, archived board feeds, and direct board monitoring," I replied calmly. "Execute the lead tranche revocation immediately." "The full amount Silas confirmed $1,820,000,000, I answered. "Section code conduct default during a live closing broadcast." "Understood," Silas said. "Transaction freeze initiated across all syndicate systems." By the time I returned my phone to my jacket pocket, syndicate notifications were already transmitting across international financial networks. The entire restructuring had been engineered around our lead commitment, like load-bearing steel in a skyscraper. Once our tranche was withdrawn, the financial architecture halted automatically because that was how the legal agreement had been written. When I stepped back inside the boardroom, Carlton was standing at the head of the table, attempting to restore momentum with sweeping hand gestures. "Let us reset the agenda and proceed professionally," he announced to the quiet room. Then the chief financial officer's phone vibrated loudly on the wood. He stared at the screen, his mouth slightly open. Simultaneously, Miles's phone buzzed, followed by 2 directors at the far end of the table. The vibrations traveled around the table like a series of warning alarms. "What is happening?" Carlton demanded, his composure cracking visibly. The chief financial officer looked up, his face completely drained of color. "The lead capital commitment has been revoked." Effective immediately, dead silence filled the room. Real heavy, suffocating silence. Carlton turned to Miles, his voice rising in panic. "Reverse it instantly." Miles shook his head slowly. "There is no legal mechanism to compel reversal after a valid conduct. Default trigger has been executed by the lead partner." Regina looked between the men, her eyes widening in disbelief. "Call them back right now," she snapped as though capital obeyed personal orders. Nobody laughed with her this time. Nobody moved to her defense. I retrieved my remaining notes from the table. "The revocation is final," I said. When I walked toward the glass doors, no one attempted to block my path. By early afternoon, the consequences had breached the corporate perimeter completely. That was when reality hit the executive suite with unyielding force. The leadership transition was officially suspended, wrapped in defensive press releases that attempted to frame the delay as a routine administrative pause for technical alignment. The financial markets did not interpret it that way. Neither did institutional investors or rating agencies. By 1:15 that afternoon, the 15-second video clip was circulating across every major financial network. Not the entire 2-hour meeting, just the single phrase that defined their corporate culture. Someone get that temporary assistant a coffee. A senior analyst on a national business broadcast played the clip twice before addressing the camera directly. This is not a public relations error, she observed coldly to millions of viewers. This is what executive arrogance sounds like when leadership forgets who funds their balance sheet. I watched the broadcast from the rear seat of a black sedan heading toward the airport. My phone remained face down in my lap, vibrating continuously with incoming inquiries from industry leaders. Syndicate partners wanted confirmation. Lenders sought immediate distance. Inside Hawthorne Global Energy's executive penthouse, Regina watched the exact same news coverage. I learned later from internal staff that she stared at the television screen in absolute disbelief before turning furiously on the communications director. "Take that clip down immediately," she commanded. No one moved, no one answered. That silence was answer enough. Her voice escalated into an angry shout, then broke into desperate tears when she realized her informal influence had completely vanished. The executives surrounding her did not offer sympathy. They quietly stepped away to protect their own careers and reputations. Carlton's Hawthorne attempted to reach me through a mutual acquaintance an hour later, requesting a confidential private meeting to discuss terms. I did not respond to his messages. Senior Board Director Beatrice Hawthorne moved far faster than the executive team. She convened an extraordinary emergency board session, mandated the strict preservation of all broadcast recordings, and revoked all family access to corporate facilities pending a comprehensive formal governance review. Miles Dunlap attempted to minimize the legal fallout during the emergency board conference call, but an independent director cut him off instantly. Why did legal counsel fail to intervene the moment the conduct covenant was violated on a live broadcast? The director demanded with sharp intensity. Quentin Stafford began drafting internal memorandums attempting to distance himself from the incident and shift blame onto administrative staff. It was far too late. His laughter was preserved on the primary audio track. So was his passive silence. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the board had categorized the event accurately. Not an optics inconvenience, but a fundamental failure of executive governance and risk management. If the financial market had already witnessed the truth, could the board salvage the corporation without removing the individuals who had compromised it? Beatrice Hawthorne did not invite me back to the executive suite. She requested a meeting in a private conference room on the 22nd floor, a neutral space from the main boardroom and executive offices. She arrived alone. No Carlton, no Miles. No corporate assistants carrying prepared scripts or public relations guidelines. That choice established the tone immediately. She placed a gray document folder on the table, but did not open it right away. "I am not here to defend their behavior," Beatrice stated flatly, looking me in the eye. "I am here because this company remains viable if we extract the corruption completely and restructure governance from the top down." I looked at her for a moment, then at the muted television screen on the wall displaying market tickers. The executive team in that boardroom this morning could not execute a basic professional interaction without resorting to public humiliation, I remarked. No, they could not. Beatrice acknowledged candidly without hesitation. For a brief second, I recalled the sound of corporate vice presidents laughing while my hand remained extended across the table. I maintained an even expression, but I had not forgotten the insult. I respected Beatrice's candor far more than an insincere executive apology. At least her assessment was honest and realistic. Summit Capital does not deploy institutional funds to shield executives from the consequences of their own toxic culture. I told her directly. Nor should it, Beatrice agreed. That is precisely why I am meeting you without them present. My phone vibrated once on the table. It was Silas Thorne. I accepted the call and kept it brief. A complete walk away remains our primary recommendation. Unless structural reform is guaranteed, Silas advised. Do not finance false promises or superficial changes. I understand, I replied, disconnecting the call. Beatrice opened the gray folder and pushed it across the table. It contained draft board resolutions, formal restrictions on Carlton Hawthorne's executive authority, complete revocation of Regina Hawthorne's corporate access, an independent legal audit of Miles Dunlap's department, and a formal review of Quentin Stafford's appointment. These were not vague promises. They were operational penalties with specific names attached. For the first time that day, I saw a path forward that extended beyond simple retaliation or exit. Not rescuing their executive team, but forcing them to build a governance structure worthy of institutional capital. Beatrice permitted me to review the documents in silence before asking, "What are your non-negotiable requirements to reopen negotiations?" I closed the folder and rested my hand on the cover. "If you want Summit Capital back at the negotiating table," I answered, "my terms will be delivered in writing within 3 hours." She nodded once without hesitation. "So, if I agreed to resume negotiations, how many individuals would have to be removed from the room that had once treated me as disposable?" I transmitted our revised term sheet before sunset that evening. It contained no soft language, only precise operational requirements designed to protect institutional capital. The $2,800,000,000 capital package was secondary to the governance architecture required to enforce accountability across all operational divisions. First, the permanent exclusion of Regina Hawthorne from all corporate properties, board functions, executive events, and internal communications. She was to be stripped of all informal authority and barred from entering any company facility without prior written authorization from the board of directors. Second, 12 months of direct board oversight, governing Carlton Hawthorne's operational decisions requiring dual signature approval for any capital expenditure exceeding $500,000 or any contract modification impacting debt covenants. Third, financial compliance and risk management, reporting directly to the board of directors rather than the chief executive officer, establishing an independent check on executive authority. Fourth, the immediate termination of Miles Dunlap as general counsel for failure to enforce corporate covenants and the complete cancellation of Quentin Stafford's executive appointment. Fifth, the binding inclusion of a strict anti-nepotism covenant within the corporate bylaws, preventing any family members from holding executive or advisory roles without unanimous board consent. Sixth, a permanent capital oversight seat on the board assigned to Summit Capital, held directly by Nathaniel Kingsley, with full veto authority over future debt restructuring. Beatrice Hawthorne called within 20 minutes of receiving the formal transmission. She did not sound surprised by the stringency of the conditions. "We can execute the majority of these terms," she stated clearly. "You know where the primary resistance will originate during the emergency voting session." "Carlton," I said, leaning back in my desk chair as I reviewed the market data. "Yes," she confirmed. "He still believes he can preserve his personal leadership structure while securing your capital. He thinks he can separate his wife's public insult from his own fiduciary obligations under the Caremark doctrine of oversight liability. He is organizing a small faction of loyal directors to challenge the compliance framework, arguing that external capital partners should not dictate internal management structures. He is attempting to convince them that this is merely a negotiating posture rather than an absolute legal boundary." By 9 o'clock the following morning, I returned to the 22nd floor conference room for the follow-up alignment meeting. The atmosphere was distinctly colder and more subdued than the previous day. Unopened coffee cups sat untouched between us on the polished glass table. Across the hallway, 2 facilities workers were loading heavy cardboard boxes onto a rolling cart outside an executive office suite. No one inquired whose office was being cleared out. The physical removal of files spoke for itself. Beatrice had already presented our term sheet to the full board of directors during a late-night emergency session. Most independent directors recognized the commercial reality immediately. Without Summit's lead tranche of $1,820,000,000, the company faced immediate credit downgrades, debt defaults, and insolvency proceedings within 30 days. The financial pressure was overwhelming, and the directors knew their own fiduciary liability under federal securities law was on the line if the deal collapsed. They were not willing to sacrifice their personal wealth to shield an arrogant executive family. The only individual attempting to negotiate against mathematical reality was Carlton Hawthorne. His counterproposal arrived through Miles Dunlap, wrapped in dense legal terminology that barely concealed the underlying desperation of an executive losing control. His counterproposal suggested replacing secondary legal counsel, reassigning public relations staff, and reframing Regina's behavior as an isolated personal lapse brought on by temporary stress. It sought to preserve Carlton's unchecked executive authority while offering no genuine structural accountability to institutional investors. A superficial fix designed to protect executive privilege and family influence at the expense of corporate integrity. I reviewed the document once, placed it flat on the table, and pushed it back across the glass toward Beatrice. No, Beatrice did not attempt to persuade me or soften our stance. She watched my expression, then gave a brief nod, having fully anticipated my response. I will not allocate institutional capital to an organization that prioritizes family arrogance over fiduciary responsibility, I stated firmly. That is not reform. That is self-deception disguised as compromise. If Carlton Hawthorne cannot accept institutional accountability, Summit Capital will withdraw permanently before noon today, and we will initiate legal recovery for all accrued syndication fees. Down the executive corridor, Regina was employing a different strategy entirely: emotional outrage and protests. An administrative assistant later confirmed that she wept openly in Carlton's office, arguing passionately that he was morally obligated to protect his family above corporate obligations and board demands. She accused him of cowardice for considering terms that stripped her of corporate standing and public influence. Carlton did not answer her immediately. He stared down at his desk, realizing for the first time that the price of indulging her arrogance had finally become personal and financial. His prolonged silence expressed far more than his words ever could. He understood that protecting her pride meant destroying his own career. By mid-afternoon, the board of directors presented Carlton Hawthorne with an absolute ultimatum: execute Summit's complete governance reform package in full without modification, or face immediate formal removal by board vote and catastrophic financial restructuring under bankruptcy protection when forced to decide who would Carlton Hawthorne preserve first, his wife's social position or his own executive career. Carlton Hawthorne signed the binding reform package at 4 o'clock that afternoon, without looking up from the mahogany desk. Not with the demeanor of a chief executive officer commanding his board, but like a defeated manager, forced to settle a debt he had ignored for far too long. He signed every page in complete silence, handing the executed document directly to Beatrice Hawthorne without looking anyone in the eye. His signing marked the formal surrender of unchecked executive power within Hawthorne Global Energy. The corporate resolution was immediately recorded in the official main book of the board of directors, establishing a binding legal precedent across the organization. The first person to challenge his decision was Regina. She declared the agreement an unbearable personal betrayal, escalating rapidly from anger to disbelief. As she realized her corporate access had been permanently terminated by board resolution, she attempted to enter the executive suite later that afternoon, only to find 2 corporate security officers standing firmly outside this glass doors. "I am the chief executive's wife," she demanded, her voice echoing uncomfortably down the polished corridor. "Not for this facility," the lead officer replied calmly, maintaining his position without moving an inch. Her electronic access badge had already been deactivated in the system. Her corporate calendar invitations vanished from the network. The corner office space she had utilized for personal projects was reassigned to the compliance department before the end of the week. She attempted to contact directors who had previously answered her calls on the first ring. Every single call went directly to automated voicemail. No one was willing to risk their board standing for someone who had become an active liability. When Carlton filed for legal separation 3 days later to protect his remaining personal assets from joint liability under the legal doctrine of dissipation of assets, her corporate influence ceased entirely and permanently. She was forced to vacate the corporate residence and relinquish all company vehicles within 48 hours. The social network that had once celebrated her arrogance dissolved completely as news of the formal separation spread across executive circles in the city. She learned quickly that corporate loyalty disappears the second financial standing is revoked and the cameras stop rolling. Quentin Stafford attempted a different survival tactic. He authored lengthy internal memorandums attempting to reframe his involvement as strategic neutrality during a complex negotiation. At first, colleagues copied him on email chains out of old habit. Then the communication stopped abruptly. By the time the board formally canceled his executive appointment, his operational authority had already evaporated completely. He was given 2 hours to clear his desk under security escort, leaving the building without a severance package or professional endorsement. His career in executive logistics was effectively over, as no major financial firm would touch a candidate linked to such high-profile corporate failure. Miles Dunlap attempted to demonstrate his indispensability by citing complex regulatory procedures and historical corporate filings. However, independent legal counsel hired by the board systematically replaced his opinions with straightforward compliance protocols. When directors ceased consulting him prior to board votes, his authority ended long before his official exit from the building. His legal career was permanently tarnished by the documented compliance failures. Carlton remained chief executive officer in title, but his operational reach was severely constrained. Direct board oversight monitored his daily decisions. Compliance reported independently to the board chairman. Family members were permanently barred from corporate operations and as executive spaces. He retained the corner office, but lost the unchecked power he had abused for years. Beatrice Hawthorne executed the remaining governance updates with systematic precision, strict anti-nepotism rules, mandatory conduct standards linked directly to capital releases and independent reporting lines for all financial controls across the entire corporate structure. I returned to Hawthorne Global Energy's main boardroom 1 week later for the formal closing of the $2,800,000,000 restructuring package. When I stepped into the room, my leather nameplate was positioned prominently at the center of the mahogany table, exactly where the empty space had been 7 days prior. A fresh cup of coffee rested beside it, served appropriately without theater or condescension. The table microphones were active. 4 cameras were recording for the official record. Nobody laughed for a brief, quiet second. I allowed myself to reflect on what that room had attempted to strip away. Then I took my seat at the conference table and opened my binder. Carlton sat 2 places down, noticeably quieter than the surrounding directors. He looked at my nameplate once, then lowered his gaze, finally comprehending what that empty space had cost his. 3 months later, Regina Hawthorne was completely separated from the company, the corporate offices, and the executive lifestyle she had weaponized against others. Quentin Stafford and Miles Dunlap were fully replaced by qualified professionals with unblemished records. Carlton Hawthorne remained CEO in title, but possessed no unmonitored authority in any room that mattered. Beatrice Hawthorne established genuine corporate governance across the organization, and I maintained permanent capital oversight at the center of the table. A corporation does not collapse because of a single arrogant sentence. It collapses because too many leaders listen to that sentence and assume cruelty carries no consequence. Dignity is never a minor detail. Boardrooms do not reveal character when transactions are smooth. They reveal it when someone assumes there will be no cost for treating others as disposable.